Long before the sun peeked over the flat horizon of Maryland's eastern shore, a young girl stirred on a straw pallet. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. She was called Minty then, born Araminta Ross, in a small wooden cabin tucked under tall loblolly pines. Outside, the world was quiet except for the distant murmur of a creek. Minty opened her eyes and looked through a gap in the cabin wall. There, suspended in the deep indigo sky, was a single brilliant star, the Morning Star, steady and unwavering. She did not know its name yet, but she felt that it was watching over the fields, over the quarter, over her. Her mother, Harriet Ross, whom everyone called Old Rit, was already moving outside, stirring the fire, preparing the meager day's cornmeal. The cabin was small, with a dirt floor worn smooth by bare feet. A few patches of sunlight, still pale, crept in through the cracks. Minty rose quietly, not wanting to wake the other children. She was slight, with deep-set eyes that held a quiet knowing. The morning star accompanied her as she stepped out into the dewy grass, her first duty to fetch water from the nearby spring. The path was lined with sweet gum trees, their leaves whispering in the early breeze. Everything that morning seemed hushed, as if the world were still dreaming. As she grew, Minty spent her days in the fields, learning to read the land the way the sun moved, the scent of rain, the call of a whippoorwill. She hoed corn under a vast sky, the heat of summer baking the earth. Yet, even in the harshest heat, she would pause and watch a hawk circle overhead, free and fierce. Her father Ben Ross taught her the secrets of the woods, which plants healed, how to walk silently, how to navigate by the stars. He would point to the Big Dipper and call it the drinking gourd. He would say that some folks followed it north to freedom. The words settled in her like seeds in dark soil. One day, when Minty was around 12 years old, an overseer at a crossroads store threw a heavy iron weight at another enslaved boy. The weight missed its mark and struck Minty in the head instead. She crumpled to the ground, blood spreading on the dry planks. They carried her home, limp and unconscious. For days she lay in the dim cabin, breathing shallowly, while her mother smoothed cool cloths over her forehead and mumbled prayers. The only light came from the fire and thin strips of sunlight through the wood. A deep, deep sleep held her, and the world outside faded to a distant hush. During the long weeks of healing, her mother Old Rit seldom left her side. She would hum the old spirituals, songs about chariots swinging low and sweet rivers of Jordan. The dim cabin became a sanctuary of soft sound and flickering firelight. Minty, drifting in and out of her strange sleeping spells, saw visions, a green valley rippling with grain, a mighty river that carried a multitude of souls toward a brilliant light. Even the wooden walls of the cabin seemed to breathe with the rhythm of hope. And always, when she opened her eyes, the morning star was waiting in the crack of the window shutter, as faithful as a prayer. After many days, Minty opened her eyes. A new silence filled the room, different from before. She would drift into sudden sleeping spells, moments when the world fell away without warning. But her dreams were more vivid than ever. She saw herself wading through a wide river, the water cool around her ankles, a bright star guiding her footsteps. She felt that God was speaking to her in these visions, planting a seed of purpose deep in her soul. From then on, she moved with a quiet certainty, as if an invisible hand rested on her shoulder. Often her mother would find her staring out the window, not with sorrow, but with a deep calm. Her head injury left her with a deep scar and episodes of sudden sleep, but it also sharpened her other senses. She could smell rain long before it arrived. She could feel the hidden paths in a forest like a vibration in her bones. Minty began to work in the house of the Broaddus family, cooking, cleaning, minding the children, yet always finding moments to slip outside and gaze at the horizon. The morning star remained her companion, its light a silent promise that there was something beyond the fields and the endless work, something vast and kind and waiting. Sometimes, late at night, she would sit by the dying fire and let the silence wrap around her like a blanket, feeling that one day she would follow that star. As the years passed, the star stayed faithful, rising every dawn over Bucktown. Minty grew into a young woman, her body strong from labor, her spirit like a coiled spring. She had not yet spoken the word freedom aloud, but it pulsed in her heartbeat. When she looked across the Choptank River, she sometimes saw the far shore blurred with morning mist, a place that seemed to whisper of a different life. And at night, before sleep took her, she would listen to the sound of the wind in the corn and allow herself to imagine what it might feel like to be utterly, wholly free. The Morning Star listened and held its peace. By the time she was in her mid-20s, the girl called Minty had taken her mother's name, Harriet, after marrying a free carpenter named John Tubman. Their cabin sat near the edge of a pine forest, with a sliver of marshland stretching beyond. In the evenings, Harriet would walk barefoot through the tall salt grass, feeling the breeze lift from the Chesapeake. The grass whispered secrets in the fading light, and Harriet stood still, as if listening for a voice that came not from the world, but from inside her own heart. The sky above turned from blush to violet, and one silver star appeared, steady and sure. It was the North Star, the star her father had taught her to find. Life in the cabin was quiet and frugal. John worked odd jobs, repairing roofs and wagons, while Harriet continued to labor for the Brodess family, cooking, washing, working the fields. Yet Harriet had a special arrangement. She sometimes hired her own time, paying a fee to her enslaver so she could work extra hours and keep a few pennies. Late into the night, she would wash clothes in a wooden tub under a lean-to, the lantern casting a small golden pool of light. Her hands grew rough, but the coins she saved she hid in a tin box under a floorboard. It was not enough to buy freedom, but it was enough to nourish a hope as delicate as the lace of a spider's web in the morning dew. The threat of being sold deeper south hung over every enslaved person like a gathering storm. The sugar and rice plantations of the Deep South were known as death traps, where labor was even more brutal. Harriet had seen families torn apart at the auction block in Cambridge. She carried that fear with her always, a cold knot in her stomach. But she also carried storehouses of quiet strength. In the fields, while working alongside other women, she would hear snatches of song steal away to Jesus, and know they were not just about heaven, but about a secret path right here on earth. The songs were a map of longing. One afternoon, while cutting rye with a sickle, Harriet paused and looked up at the sky, where a hawk circled in a wide, easy arc. The other women nearby lowered their voices, and one of them, an older woman named Aunt Sue, hummed a tune that spoke of the drinking gourd. She traced the Big Dipper in the air with a dirt-blackened finger. "Follow the drinking gourd," she whispered, "and you'll find your way north." Harriet felt a chill, not of fear, but of recognition. She already knew the stars by heart. They were like friends in the dark ceiling of the world, and now she understood they could be guides. Back at the cabin, late at night, Harriet would sit by the small window and watch the North Star through the glass. John would be asleep, his breathing steady and low. She loved him, but their marriage was shadowed by a harsh truth. She was property, and any child she bore would inherit chains. The very idea made her stomach tighten. The star outside, however, seemed to pulse with a gentle rhythm, as if it were a heartbeat shining down from a far country. Sometimes Harriet would press her palm against the cool glass and make a silent vow, not in words, but in the fierce, quiet language of her soul, a language the universe seemed to understand. The whisper of the Underground Railroad was growing louder. She heard that certain white people, Quakers mostly, offered shelter to runaways. She heard of a man named Moses, no one knew his real name, who led people to a place called Canada, where slavery could not touch you. These stories were passed like heirlooms, wrapped in caution and code. Harriet listened intently, her dark eyes reflecting the embers. She had never been more than a few miles from the Brodess plantation, but she could draw a map in her mind. The Choptank River leading north, then Delaware, then Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, where many free Black people lived. It seemed impossibly far, yet the North Star was only a glance away. In the summer of 1849, the Brodess family's financial troubles worsened, and whispers of selling slaves circulated. Harriet's owner, Edward Brodess, fell ill, and his widow might be forced to sell property to pay debts. Harriet knew her time was running out. She knelt in the tall grass one evening, the stalks swaying above her head, golden in the last light. The insects hummed a low, constant note. She closed her eyes and felt the earth beneath her knees, solid and forgiving. When she opened them again, the North Star had already emerged, a diamond set in a wash of lavender twilight. She rose, brushed off her dress, and walked back toward the cabin with a peace she had never felt before. That night, she did not sleep. She packed a few things: a small piece of ash cake, her tin box of coins, a cherished quilt square her mother had given her. John was away, working on a roof in the next county. The cabin was still and dark. Harriet lit a single candle stub and looked at the walls, at the familiar cracks and shadows that had witnessed her whole life. The flame flickered, sending soft shapes dancing across the ceiling. She blew it out, and in the darkness, she heard the wind rustling the pines, a sound like a blessing whispered through the ages. The morning star would not rise for hours yet, but Harriet was ready. She would set out before dawn, into the unknown, guided by earth and sky. The night she finally left was moonless and thick with the scent of wet earth. Harriet slipped out of the familiar cabin, the door barely whispering against its leather hinges. The darkness wrapped around her like a cool shroud, but her feet knew every dip and root of the path leading east toward the Choptank River. She had walked it 1,000 times in the daylight. Now she walked it in a blindness that sharpened every sound: the rustle of a rodent, the distant bark of a dog. Overhead, the sky was a deep velvet pierced by a scatter of stars, and there, unblinking, was the drinking gourd, pointing the way. Harriet's heart beat steady, not frantic. She was not running, she was walking home. She had tried to escape earlier with her brothers, but their courage had faltered, and they had turned back, pulling her with them. This time, she would go alone. She was determined that no one, not fear, not love, not the threat of hounds, would stop her. She reached the river's edge where the water was wide and dark, smelling of mud and reeds. Without hesitation, she stepped in, the cool water rising to her knees, then her waist. She moved slowly, carefully, so as not to splash. The current was gentle, as if the river itself understood her mission. On the far bank, she paused and looked back only once, seeing the faint outline of the slave quarters' cookfire smoke against the stars. Then she turned north. All that night she walked, following the water north and the stars above. She passed through stands of oak and pine, the ground soft with needles that silenced her footfalls. An owl called out a lonesome, calming sound. In her hand, she clutched a small bag with ash cake and her coins. Her dress, once pale, was dark with mud and river water. She moved with the quiet grace of a deer, aided by the stillness her sleeping spells forced upon her body. When a spell came, she would lean against a trunk, close her eyes for a few heartbeats, then rise again, refreshed, as if a great peace had seeped into her bones. As dawn approached, Harriet found a potato hole, a deep, round pit covered with a wooden hatch, used to store sweet potatoes through the winter. She lifted the hatch and climbed down into the cool, earthy darkness. It smelled of damp soil and sprouting tubers. She pulled the hatch closed above her, and the world became a hollow of utter silence. There, in the belly of the earth, she rested, her back against the packed dirt. She allowed herself a small piece of ash cake, chewing slowly, and felt the safety of concealment. Outside, the birds began their morning chorus, but no one came. The potato hole held her like a secret kept by the ground itself. The next night, she walked again, and the night after that, until the landscape began to change. The wetlands gave way to rolling fields and small farmhouses with candlelit windows. Harriet had been told to look for a house with a white star on a quilt hanging from a porch. Just before daybreak, she saw it, a simple frame house with a patchwork quilt draped over the railing, a lantern burning in the downstairs window. Her heart swelled, but she approached carefully, as she had been taught. A woman with a kind face opened the door, a Quaker by the gray of her dress and the gentle light in her eyes. She spoke in a low voice, "Thou art welcome, friend." Harriet stepped into warmth and light. Inside, the house smelled of bread and herbs. The Quaker woman gave her a bowl of warm porridge and a cloth to wipe her face. Her husband, a quiet man, nodded and said nothing, but brought fresh straw to cover a hidden crawl space where Harriet could sleep. Daylight broke, and Harriet curled into the tiny space, walls of wood above her, a blanket of straw around her. She dozed not a full sleep, but a healing rest, listening to the household sounds, the swish of a broom, the clink of a spoon in a pot, the murmur of a prayer. She had never known such simple kindness from a stranger. It flowed into her like warm honey. After resting, guided by directions whispered to her, Harriet continued her journey through Delaware and into Pennsylvania. The landscape grew hillier, the air cooler. The final night was misty, with a faint drizzle that cloaked the world in gray velvet. She walked along a wagon road, the wheels of carriages long gone, and saw before her a stone marker that she could not read. But she knew what it meant. At the crest of a hill, as the drizzle lifted and the first pale light of dawn stained the clouds pink, she crossed an unseen line. The birds in the meadows sang as if to celebrate. Pennsylvania, a free state, lay beneath her feet. She stood still, feeling the sun warm her face, and for the first time in her life, she breathed air that belonged to no master. Harriet later described that moment as a revelation. She looked at her hands to see whether she was the same person, and she was, but the world around her had transformed. Colors seemed brighter, the green of the grass, the blue of the sky, the brown of the road. She saw a golden sunrise spilling over the hills, and she felt, for the first time, that she was truly a passenger on this earth, not a possession. The sun climbed higher, melting the mist, and Harriet Tubman, no longer a slave, walked on toward Philadelphia with a heart so full it could have held the entire sky. Somewhere behind her, a star had set, but a new inner star had just risen, and it would never fade. After tasting freedom in Philadelphia, Harriet could have remained safe, finding work as a cook or laundress. But her heart would not let her rest. She thought constantly of her family still in Maryland, her mother, her father, her brothers and sisters. The Underground Railroad had welcomed her, and now she resolved to become a conductor on its invisible tracks. She took small jobs, saved money, and studied the secret networks with fierce attention. The city's cobblestone streets and brick buildings became her classroom. In the quiet of her rented room, by the light of a single candle, she traced routes on a mental map, murmuring the names of rivers and the descriptions of safe houses she had memorized. The candle flame danced, a tiny star of resolve. When she returned to Maryland for the first time, she moved like a shadow through the familiar landscape. It was autumn, and the leaves had turned gold and russet, drifting silently onto the paths. She traveled at night, hugging the edges of fields, staying close to the dark ribbon of the Choptank. She knew where the bloodhounds were kept, where the patrollers rode. But she also knew the location of every friendly door, every hidden cellar. As she approached the plantation where her family still labored, the air grew heavy with memory. The tobacco barn stood dark against the starry sky, and the quarter was silent. She crouched by a hedge and gave a low, owl-like call, the signal she had prearranged. A door cracked open, and her sister's face appeared, pale with hope. A lantern in a window was a simple yet sacred symbol on the Underground Railroad. Quaker homes often kept a single candle burning all night, placed on a sill facing the road. To a weary fugitive, that small flame was a beacon of rest and protection. One such home, tucked among rolling hills in Delaware, belonged to a family named Garrett. The house was built of fieldstone, with a deep cellar that held barrels of apples and a hidden compartment behind a false wall. Harriet described it as a place where the angels spread their wings. When she arrived with a group of trembling passengers, the Quaker matron would lead them to the cellar, hand out warm biscuits, and whisper that they were safe in God's hands. The lantern in the window never went out. Harriet often led her charges through the Great Dismal Swamp and other wetlands, where water muffled sound and scent. The night air would be thick with the smell of decaying leaves and the distant croak of frogs. She would wade into the shallows first, testing the depth, then motion others to follow. The moon, when it was full, turned the swamp into a silver dreamscape, Spanish moss hanging like ghostly curtains. Her passengers moved in single file, holding onto the shirt of the person in front. Harriet sometimes hummed a spiritual, so softly it was almost a breath. "Wade in the water," she would sing, "God's gonna trouble the water." The melody floated above the reeds, a lullaby of liberation, and it steadied the hearts of those who were afraid. She always carried a pistol tucked into her dress, not out of a desire to harm, but as an instrument of resolve. She knew that a single passenger who lost nerve and tried to turn back could endanger the entire group. With calm finality, she would stand before the frightened one and say, "You'll be free or die a slave." Her voice never rose. It was as soft as the rustle of leaves, but it carried an authority that brooked no argument. The pistol remained holstered, a symbol of sacred commitment. In the stillness of those midnight forests, the quiet words settled the matter. The runaways would nod, swallow their fear, and press onward, trusting the small woman with the unwavering eyes. The network stretched from the border states all the way to Canada. Safe houses were often spaced 10 to 20 miles apart, a distance a person could walk in a single night. Harriet timed her journeys with the phases of the moon, preferring the dark of the new moon for concealment, but sometimes using the full moon for navigation. She knew each station by heart: a barn with a loose board near Chestertown, a root cellar behind a cooper's shop in Camden, a cave near Wilmington. Each stop offered a brief pause of warmth. There was always a lantern, a blanket, a drink of water, and always a silent prayer. In those brief hours of rest, Harriet would sit near her sleeping charges, watching over them, her own sleep held at bay by love and duty. Once, during a journey through a dense pine forest, the group heard the distant bay of hounds. Harriet reacted with immediate, silent precision. She led them off the path and down into a creek, where they walked single file in the cold water for nearly a mile, throwing off the scent. The hounds' cries grew faint, then disappeared. Nobody spoke. When they finally climbed out onto a mossy bank, dawn was beginning to lighten the sky. Harriet pointed ahead to a smoking chimney rising above the treetops, a safe house where a fire was already lit. The weary travelers quickened their pace, and Harriet allowed herself a small, barely perceptible smile. The stars were fading overhead, but the lantern in the window was growing brighter. In all her missions, Harriet Tubman never lost a single passenger. They would arrive at the last stations, often in upstate New York or across the Canadian border, weary but alive. The final image she carried in her mind was not of danger, but of the first free morning, a group of people standing in a dew-soaked meadow, watching a golden sun rise over land where no auction block stood. They were blinking in the light, feeling the foreign, wonderful weight of liberty. Harriet would embrace each one, then turn and walk back into the shadows, the same quiet woman who had once watched the Morning Star over Bucktown. And somewhere behind her, in a window across the miles, a lantern burned on. The years passed, and Harriet's legend grew quietly. Even as the nation edged toward civil war, she continued her night walks, leading more people north. The seasons painted the landscape in cycles: the tender green of spring, the deep shade of summer, the gold of autumn, the stark lace of winter. Through all of them, Harriet moved like a patient thread weaving through a dark tapestry. She knew the scent of wild roses blooming by a safe house porch and the crunch of frost underfoot on a December trail. Each journey was a silent conversation with the land, a deepening of her covenant. At night, she still looked up at the same stars she had known as a child, and they still shone down with the same ancient kindness. When the Civil War began, Harriet Tubman offered her services to the Union Army. She knew the rivers and marshlands of the South better than most generals. At first, she worked as a nurse, tending to soldiers in field hospitals that were little more than canvas tents pitched near the water. The air smelled of iodine and salt, and the sound of waves mingled with the moans of the wounded. Harriet moved among the cots with a lantern in her hand, her touch light on fevered foreheads. She brewed herbal remedies from roots she collected herself, a knowledge passed down from her father. In the dim light, she would speak softly, calming the dying, telling them stories of Maryland mornings, of birdsong and soft rain. Her presence was a balm. Her most remarkable wartime mission came in June of 1863, when she guided 3 Union gunboats up the Combahee River in South Carolina. The night before the mission, she stood on the deck, a light sea breeze lifting the hem of her dress. She pointed out the location of hidden torpedoes, recalled the plantations along the banks, and instructed the pilots where to steer. As the boats moved silently through the pre-dawn mist, the only sound was the gentle churning of paddle wheels and the occasional call of a marsh bird. Harriet's voice was calm, steady, as she whispered directions. The stars were fading, and a pale pink light began to bloom over the water. That morning, over 700 enslaved people would taste their first day of freedom. As the boats neared the rice fields, Harriet gave a signal. Soldiers and sailors quietly disembarked, and word spread like wildfire among the slave quarters. Men, women, and children poured out of the fields, clutching bundles of clothing, carrying babies, splashing through the shallow water toward the boats. There was no panic, only a great, silent surge of hope. Harriet stood at the gangplank, guiding them aboard as if she were Moses at the shore of the Red Sea. She recognized some by face, and they whispered her name, Moses. The sun climbed, burning off the mist, and the river sparkled as the boats, heavy with their precious cargo, turned back toward freedom. It was the largest slave rescue operation of the war, conducted with quiet navigation and deep tenderness. After the war, Harriet returned to Auburn, New York, where she had purchased a small piece of land from Senator William Seward years earlier. The brick house sat on a gentle slope, surrounded by maples and a sprawling garden. The town was peaceful, with cobblestone streets and a drowsy, rural charm. Here, Harriet planted vegetables, tomatoes, beans, sweet potatoes, and flowers of every color, marigolds, zinnias, roses. The garden became a sanctuary, not just for her, but for the many people she took in, elderly parents, children needing a home, neighbors down on their luck. The air smelled of damp soil and blooming lavender. In the evenings, she would walk between the rows, touching the petals, speaking softly to the plants as if they were old friends. Her father, Ben Ross, had been bought and freed by friends, and he came to live with her in Auburn. He would sit on the porch in the afternoons, a shawl over his shoulders, and watch the light change. Harriet would bring him tea, sweetened with honey, and sit beside him. They rarely spoke. Their companionship was woven through silence. The elder trees on the property rustled with the same sound Harriet remembered from the pine woods of Maryland. It was a sound of deep time, of roots holding firm. Ben would sometimes hum an old song, and Harriet would close her eyes, letting the melody carry her back to the cabin where she first saw the morning star. But she was no longer fleeing. She was home. The garden provided food for her extended household, and surplus vegetables were shared with the poor. Harriet would fill a basket with whatever was ripe, squash, turnips, a handful of herbs, and walk into town to deliver the bounty. She moved slowly now, her back a bit bent, but her eyes still held that quiet fire. The town children would run to meet her, calling her Aunt Harriet, and she would give them a peppermint candy from her pocket. She was a fixture of the peaceful streets, a small woman in a shawl and bonnet, walking under the canopy of elms. No one who saw her could guess that she had once walked through night after night with hundreds of lives depending on her steady heart. At twilight, Harriet often sat on the porch watching the sky deepen, the first star appearing above the horizon. The star was the same one that had led her across rivers and through swamps. But now it was simply a companion, not a guide. She would rest her hands on her knees, worn from decades of labor, and breathe in the cool evening air. Sometimes a neighbor would pass by and wave, sometimes a child would bring her a drawing. Harriet would smile, and in that smile was the accumulated peace of a life spent serving others. The crickets began their nightly chorus, and the world settled into a hush. In the garden, the flowers folded their petals for the night, safe in the soil of freedom. The kitchen in Harriet's Auburn home was small but filled with warmth. On winter mornings, she would stoke the wood stove until the iron glowed with a soft red light. The room would fill with the smell of baking bread and brewing tea. Her rescued parents, Ben and Rit, sat at the wooden table, their hands folded, watching the snow fall outside the window. Harriet would slice thick pieces of bread and spread butter, talking softly about the weather, the birds at the feeder, the simple plenty of a free morning. The window glass was coated with frost, making the outside world a blur of white and gray, but inside, the kitchen was a portrait of domestic peace, a peace she had fought a lifetime to claim. Harriet never stopped caring for others. When she was not in the kitchen, she was in the garden, harvesting vegetables, or in town, visiting the sick. In the 1890s, she purchased an adjacent lot and opened the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, a charity to shelter elderly and indigent Black people. The building was simple, 2 stories with a wide porch. She would walk over each day, a shawl draped around her shoulders, to visit the residents. She would sit with them in the sun, holding their hands, and tell them stories not of her own heroism, but of the kindness of strangers on the dark road north. Her voice was a low, soothing murmur, like a creak over stones. The garden in high summer was a living quilt of color. Marigolds blazed orange, roses climbed trellises, and bees hummed among the squash blossoms. Harriet would kneel in the soil, her hands dark with dirt, pulling weeds with patient care. The sun warmed her back, and the scent of tomato leaves hung in the air. She often wore a faded bonnet and a dress patched with careful stitches. From the porch, a cat watched, tail twitching. Children from the neighborhood would come to help, and Harriet would reward them with a small coin or a cookie, her face crinkling into a grin. The whole scene was washed in golden light, so quiet you could hear the flutter of a butterfly's wings. In that garden, the nightmare of bondage felt as distant as a forgotten dream. As she aged, Harriet's sleeping spells, which had never entirely left her, grew more frequent. She did not see them as a burden. They were like sudden visits from a trusted old friend, a brief retreat into that inner landscape where the stars still shone. In church, during a sermon, she might close her eyes and drift, and the congregation would simply sing a little softer around her, a cradle of voices. When she stirred, her face would be peaceful, and she would join the hymn without missing a word. The children in the front pew would turn to watch, learning that rest could be holy. Even in her sleep, there was a deep, abiding grace. Despite her modest means, Harriet traveled to suffrage conventions and meetings, speaking in her quiet, unwavering voice about the intersection of freedom and women's rights. She never stood on a podium with fiery oration. Rather, she would sit in a wooden chair, the light from a window falling across her face, and recount the simple truth of her experiences. She spoke of nights under the stars, of the women who had kept safe houses, of the courage of the enslaved mothers who risked all for their children. Her words were seeds of quiet power, and they took root in the hearts of those who listened. After each talk, she would be surrounded by women pressing her hands, some with tears in their eyes. Harriet would nod gently as if to say, "Yes, we have both walked the same long road." As the new century unfolded, Harriet grew more frail. She received a pension from the government for her war service, $20 a month, which she used to support her household and the home for the aged. Neighbors and admirers sent gifts of food, books, and knitted scarves. She spent more time indoors now, sitting by a sunlit window with a quilt on her lap, a cup of tea cooling on the sill. The garden still bloomed outside, tended by younger hands. Harriet would watch the bees busily working, and sometimes she would fall into one of her brief sleeps, dreaming she was back in the pine woods, walking without effort, the North Star blazing overhead, and no chains anywhere to be seen. On clear afternoons, Harriet would receive visitors, journalists, historians, former abolitionists, and young students. They came to hear the story of Moses from her own lips. She would sit with them in the parlor, a photograph of herself as a young woman on the mantel, and speak softly. She never embellished. She let the plain facts shine with their own profound light. The ticking of a clock measured the silence between her sentences, and the visitors would lean forward, not wanting to miss a single word. When the interview ended, she would offer them a piece of apple from her own tree, perhaps a cup of cool water, and they would leave as if they had touched a living piece of history. In the final years, Harriet's world contracted to the walls of her home, but it was filled with the fragrance of fresh lilacs and the sound of hymns. Her friends and adopted children cared for her with the same devotion she had once shown others. In the evenings, when the house grew still, the setting sun would cast a long golden rectangle through the window, illuminating the dust motes that drifted in the air. Harriet would watch them, her mind drifting, and she would feel an immense gratitude, not for fame, but for the simple, quiet miracle of being free and loved. Outside, the first star would appear, the same star, and she would whisper a prayer of thanks, as gentle as a lullaby. In the early spring of 1913, the world outside Harriet Tubman's window was beginning to stir with green. The snow had melted, and crocuses pushed up through the garden soil. Inside the brick house on South Street, the room was quiet, filled with the soft light of a March morning. Harriet lay in her bed, her breathing slow and even. Her face, lined with 91 years of life, was serene. Around her stood a few dear friends and members of the church, their voices low, reciting the familiar words of the 23rd Psalm. The lace curtains moved gently in the breeze from the half-open window, as if the earth itself was breathing in sympathy. Harriet had been declining for some time, but her spirit remained as clear as spring water. In her lucid moments, she would speak of the promised land, not with fear, but with the same quiet anticipation she had once felt when crossing the line into Pennsylvania. She told those gathered at her bedside that she saw a bright light, a river, and fields of everlasting green. She mentioned her old friend John Brown, whom she had supported years before, and said she heard the angels singing. Her voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a full and faithful life. She drifted in and out of consciousness, each return like a brief visit from a beloved neighbor. On the 10th of March, as the sun climbed higher and the morning light turned from silver to gold, Harriet opened her eyes one last time. She spoke her final words, "I go to prepare a place for you," taken from the scriptures that had comforted her through so many dark journeys. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then her eyes closed, and a great peace settled over her features. Outside, a robin began to sing, a clear, sweet note that rose and fell. The world continued, tender and unchanged, but a mighty soul had slipped its earthly mooring. The friend who held her hand said afterward that it felt as though a gentle tide had carried her home. The community of Auburn, and indeed the whole nation, mourned her passing. She was given a full military funeral, with a formation of soldiers standing at attention, their rifles reversed in a gesture of honor. The service was held in the Thompson Memorial AME Zion Church, the same church she had attended for years. The pews were filled with people of all races, all backgrounds. The sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns on the wooden floor. A choir sang "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," and the melody floated up like incense. Outside, the cemetery awaited, a quiet field under tall elms, where Harriet would find her rest, near her parents, under the shelter of the same sky. At the graveside, a bugler played taps, its notes drifting over the quiet grass, a final lullaby. Harriet was buried with a small oak sapling planted nearby, which soon grew into a strong tree. The scent of fresh earth mingled with the perfume of early lilacs. The mourners dispersed slowly, leaving the cemetery under the soft afternoon light. Some placed small stones on her grave, an old custom of remembrance. The breeze stirred the new leaves, and the world settled into a deep and respectful stillness. In that stillness, one could almost hear the echo of a woman humming a spiritual, a sound that brought comfort to the weary and courage to the afraid. In the years that followed, Harriet Tubman's legend continued to blossom, not as a militant warrior, but as a gentle guide, a Moses who never lost a single passenger. Statues were erected showing her in mid-stride, a lantern held high. But those who truly remembered her recalled the quiet moments, the way she would pray in a whisper, the way she would stroke a child's head, the way she moved through a forest as if she were part of the trees themselves. The Underground Railroad faded into history, but the light of that lantern still burned in the collective memory, a small, steady flame that no wind could extinguish. It is that flame we remember now as we close this story. Let us end with an image of the North Star, just as it was seen from the eastern shore on a clear winter night. The sky is a deep, velvety black, strewn with a million diamonds. The star hangs low and bright, casting its quiet guidance over the dark fields, the silent rivers, the winding backroads. No one is running anymore. The land is at peace, the cabins are empty, the chains are rusted away. But the star remains, old and unchanging, a sentinel of freedom. Its light falls on a small brick house in Auburn, where a garden still blooms each spring. And in that light, something moves, perhaps the soft tread of a woman in a faded dress, forever walking the peaceful road home. And so, as sleep approaches, hold that image close, a single star glowing above a hushed world, a garden covered in dew at dawn, a woman who turned her deepest wounds into a map of mercy. The story of Harriet Tubman is not one of noise and thunder, but of a soft, persistent light that led hundreds from darkness into the gentle morning of freedom. It is a story made for the quiet hour, for the moments just before dreams. May her memory be a blessing woven into the fabric of the night. And may her lantern, small, steady, eternal, guide you, too, into a deep and peaceful rest.